Welcome to this week's episode of the Mixtape with Scott. This is your host, Scott Cunningham. I'm a professor of economics at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. This week is a guest whose work I've admired for a long time. His name's Sascha Becker. He's a professor at Monash University in Australia, Melbourne, Australia. I saw him present last year at a conference where I was a keynote in Melbourne. And it was really exciting because I was familiar with his work. I was familiar with specifically his work in economic history and religion. And to get to meet him in person was really neat. And he was just a phenomenal presenter and just such a passionate presenter and a passionate person and very intelligent. And the work was so meticulous and so deep that I've been wanting to interview him for a long time. And so I was able to now. The interview was really interesting. I hope that you like it. It kind of at a personal level, it was interesting to hear some of the things he said, because some of the things he said about sort of, I guess you might call the sociology of the spread of causal inference. He shares the exact conjecture that I've had for over a decade, which was that causal inference spread, what we would consider spread throughout economics, not through econometrics textbooks, because there weren't any, but rather really through the students of some of these people, like Josh Anger's students, Hito Imbin's students, David Card's students, through Princeton students, through at that top. And those students oftentimes were applied microeconomists as opposed to theoretical econometricians, although there were those too. And if that conjecture's right, then you should have probably seen a lot of positive selection, as you can imagine, Josh Anger's students at MIT or Card's students at Berkeley, or Imbin's students at Harvard, and then he goes to Berkeley, and then he goes to UCLA. You could just sort of imagine those students are phenomenal, and they end up themselves going to top universities, and so you just sort of see a segment, a bifurcation of the labor market, you might say, where these ideas are sort of staying in a certain world for a little while till Mostly Harmless probably comes out, and then there's a group of workers who may not have had access to it, even though they're learning econometrics, and you might say they're applied. Or they are applied. So it was kind of interesting. He articulated it exactly. And this whole time I've just thought that, I'm not saying I'm the only one who thought that way, but actually I'd never met anyone that thought that way. But it was interesting to hear Sascha kind of independently just suddenly start saying it. And I just was validated. So anyway, it was a really fascinating interview. I loved it. It was a pleasure to meet him. He's a very, very, very intelligent and passionate man, but very humble and very nice. And I hope you enjoy this. And thanks so much for listening. If you do value this podcast, please tell people about it. Share this, tell people about it. I hope that the personal stories of economists are things that really resonate with you. And I hope this continues to sort of help build the collective story of the profession. See you later. Okay, well, it's a pleasure to have my guest here this week on the show. This is, we've met before, but we've never spoken as much as I'm looking forward to. So I'm going to ask the guest, would you mind telling us your name, your title, and who pays your paycheck?
My name is Sascha Becker, and I'm currently the Chao Ka-Yang Chair of Business and Economics and Professor of Economics at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia. And I'm also part-time professor at the University of Warwick in Coventry in the UK.
Awesome, Sascha. It's so nice to have you on the podcast. So why don't we get started? So just as an icebreaker, would you mind telling me what's a vacation that you went on as a kid that to this day you sort of still think about from time to time?
Well, I guess what characterizes all our vacations is that we always went by train because my
Hmm.
dad worked for the German railways. So wherever we went, it had to be within reach by train. We never
Hmm.
took a plane anywhere. I took my first plane flight when I was, I guess, 18 or 19 and went with a mate to Ireland. And the one situation that I remember is when I was maybe 5 or 6 and we were in the south of Germany at one of Germany's biggest Lake Bodensee, Lake Constance, where I think I was a bit fearful of jumping into the lake from a little jetty. And my dad then offered me 2 Deutschmarks if I overcome my fear. And that seems to have been enough to make me jump.
Upward sloping supply curves. That's
Yeah,
it? Well,
yeah,
so where did you grow up? And what did you said you said your dad worked for the railroads?
yeah, that's correct. So
Oh.
yeah, I'm an only child. My parents both have relatively basic schooling. My dad went to school for 8 years. My mom went to school for 10 years, so I don't have any academics in my
Hmm.
ancestry.
Hmm.
And that defines also a lot of my trajectory as that we will be talking about. So I grew up in a town called Ida Oberstein,
Hmm.
which nowadays has 25,000 inhabitants or so.
Hmm.
And it's in the west of Germany, not too far from the French and the Luxembourg border.
Hmm.
And the funny thing that we maybe also will touch on later is one of the people that also went to that same high school in the middle of nowhere is Petra Moser, who's at NYU Stern.
Oh yeah.
And she also works in economic history, as I do. And what's funny about it, there was no economics in school. So
Hmm.
that was the subject. But the two of us within just 2 cohorts both ended up becoming academic economists working on economic history.
Wow. So y'all were friends?
Yeah, I mean, she's 2 years older, so we didn't interact much at school, really. But
Uh-huh.
still, it's uh, it's a funny little coincidence.
That is a
Yeah,
funny coincidence because it's such a small town.
yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if y'all talk, do y'all are y'all close now? You're
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
oh,
Very close.
that's very cool. That's very cool. Uh so your dad, he worked for the railroad. What was he doing for the railroad?
Well, he really worked his way up over time. He started an apprenticeship when he was age 13, just before his 14th birthday. And then he would just work locally in the railway station in Ida Oberstein selling tickets. And then over time, he did all kinds of additional training courses and worked his way up to places higher up in the railway administration and ended up in his last years of work in Mainz, which is 100 kilometers away from Ida Oberstein.
Mm-hmm.
It's a bigger town. But he would always commute there because he never even considered leaving the place he lived in.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
And your mom, what did you say your mom did?
Well, she was for some time working in a bank, but from the day I was born, she stayed home because that was her passion to look after her only son.
Mm.
And she never really returned to work after that.
Mm. So you
Not
were
least
close.
because she then at some point got breast cancer and
Oh,
her life became a little bit complicated.
yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Well, so what kind of games did you play as a kid in that little town?
Well, one passion we had in our group of boys, I guess, was table tennis and mini golf. And at some point, we also played tennis and squash.
Mm. Mm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And so then you go to high school. You said there's no economics in high school. Was it a bit? So I guess it wasn't a very big school though, with a being a smaller town.
Yeah, it was compared to US schools I've seen, relatively small, say. So in our graduating cohort, we were 50. I don't know
Mm,
how that compares to a typical US high school. And so we didn't have economics. We had something like social sciences.
yeah,
So a broad brush, quick ride through the big names, whatever Marx and Durkheim maybe is names we would touch on, but we didn't go into any detail really
yeah,
on most of these things. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So what was what classes were you did you like the most back then?
Well, I always loved mathematics and history, and
Oh,
then when it came to choosing a university subject, again the fact that my parents had no academic background whatsoever,
hmm,
and this was the pre-internet age, 1992. I finished high school. It meant you would kind of send letters to universities asking for brochures. And the reason I ended up in Bonn, which is a great university for both mathematics and economics, was really coincidental. My grandma was living there, and that meant I could stay for free. There were no rental costs, and given that we were rather a lower middle class type of family.
yeah,
Couldn't afford paying rent in a big city.
yeah,
So I ended up in Bonn really only because my grandma was there.
yeah.
And it wasn't really much of an academic choice. And I was more surprised as I then learned. And I started with mathematics and physics, that it was one of the best universities in the country
Uh-huh.
for these subjects. So
Yeah.
a lot in my life was accidental, say.
Yeah, yeah. That's like the David Card college in the county story where he
Yeah.
he is going to the so you start off in math and physics, but do those remain your major throughout the whole college experience?
No, again, so the thing is, I started mathematics and physics to become a school teacher, and that was following my dad's very strong advice that to have a safe job and a safe income in life, I should become a civil servant and go into
Mm,
the public school system. And that sounded quite reasonable, and I didn't have much other advice at the time.
yeah.
And so I started that. But then already in the first weeks of study, I met an economist who is now a professor in Zurich, Matthias Hoffmann,
Mm.
who already was in his third year of economics, and he studied mathematics for fun on the
Ah.
side.
Mm.
And then we would do these exercise sheets together, day and night, really. There were so many. And I always found he had an amazing intuition for stuff, whereas for
Mm.
me, it always was dry mathematics. And so we were doing stuff on differential equations and so on. And for me, that was mathematics. And he always saw applications, and that fascinated
Mm.
me somehow.
Mm.
So one day I would just go along with him to some economics lectures.
Oh.
And I found that so fascinating
Oh
that
yeah.
over time I slowly moved. So I first added economics to the pile and did a bit of both. And at some point I realized I can't study three subjects in parallel. So then I stopped mathematics and physics after 2 years and only went with econ.
Oh, so it was this friend that really got you hooked on economics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, an accidental thing, more or less. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. When you was it just what was it about economics at the very beginning that you just found yourself sticking with it? Why is it that you ended up liking it?
I think it was also just the quality of lectures and the
Yeah.
passion people had for it. Um, And I saw it in these early days as applied mathematics. Yeah? And only over time I saw it as a standalone subject. Yeah. But since my original passion was for mathematics, um, there was this applied mathematics angle. But again, something that's very peculiar in the German system is that you sometimes have these kind of substitute professors. So there may be a chair of economics, and that's currently vacant, and they are looking for a permanent hire. And given German bureaucracy, that can take 1 or 2 years. And in the meantime, they hire someone to be the substitute chairholder.
Oh.
At the time when I was taking these lectures, the micro lectures were given by Kai Konrad, who was one of the best published rising stars in the German scene back then. And macro, funnily, was Harald Uhlig, yeah, who then went on to Humboldt University and now is in Chicago. So I had these guys when they were in their 30s, yeah, or late 20s even, or early 30s. And they had been trained extremely well. They were passionate about economics, and they were very untypical of the German professor who is an old white-haired 55 to 65-year-old guy.
Yeah.
And so that probably sparked my interest in economics as a subject in itself.
That's great. Well, so was it one particular field in college that you were being drawn to, or was it just you loved all of it?
There wasn't anything specific. But I was drawn to people who were kind of out of the box, and I was truly fascinated by Reinhard Selten, yeah, so Germany's only ever Nobel laureate in economics, and he was just an amazing human being as well. So he was giving a lecture on bounded rationality that I attended in 1994. And that was at a time when these topics weren't yet mainstream. And it was maybe the early days of behavioral economics, but it's not really my area. But I liked the way he was so meticulous. He would still do old style, writing on the board with chalk, going slowly, explaining stuff. And the teaching loads in Germany for full professors are like completely crazy, 240 hours a year. And he would, on top of that, because he was a passionate teacher, he would attend all the tutorials as well and look over the shoulders of the students. So he did far more than he was ever expected to do, just because he liked teaching and wanted students to fully understand stuff. And that always impressed me with him, mixed with his absolutely outstanding humility. Yeah. So if you have 30 seconds for that story, when he won the Nobel Prize, Bonn at the university, they have this funny thing that there is a back entrance for the professors. There is like a special corridor that the academics use to enter the lecture hall, while the students come from the back side and go down the stairs into the hall. So the day he won the Nobel Prize, he had a lecture in the afternoon. And that wasn't cancelled. There was no way he would cancel a lecture. So everyone was in that lecture hall. The corridors were spilling over. There were people everywhere on the stairs. There were hundreds of people in that lecture hall and all around. And then he entered from the back door, and there were standing ovations. The whole room was like clapping like crazy for 5 minutes in a row. And when finally the clapping subsided, he was initially standing there just with an open mouth, staring into the void. And when the clapping subsided, he just said, "Now we can start." Turned around and started writing on the board. No word like "thank you." I'm so moved, but
He just
uh,
wanted,
back to business. You know, for
yeah.
him, that was the thing. He came to give a lecture, and he would give a lecture. Yeah.
That's so great. That's so great. So how old were you? What grade? What year were you when you saw that happen?
That was my, I was 21 or so, so it was my second or third year of being a student, but in
Yeah.
economics, maybe my second or third semester, given that I started that a bit later. Yeah,
Yeah. Wow. So you saw that. So you saw that happen?
yeah. I
That's
was there, and it still is burned in my mind,
wow.
this absolute humility. And he didn't change an inch after that. You know,
Oh.
and so many Nobel laureates from then on only travel the world, cash in, give lectures to big audiences. He would just do his thing. He also 1 day a week did home office in order to clean the house. His wife was
Mm.
somewhat handicapped, I think,
Mm.
and he refused to hire a cleaning woman. And instead, it was his ethic that he would do that.
Mm.
Also, to spend this day with his wife. And this humanity always stood out to me as something so special.
Yeah. Yeah. He sounds amazing. That's thank you for sharing that. That's very that mu did that have did that have an effect on where how you wanted to spend your life in economics, just seeing him like that?
I think it had many effects that only over time I realized. And uh, one of it was, given that he seemed to have such clear principles in life
Mm.
about how he saw himself and
Mm.
what it means to be a good person, for want of a better word. It was clear to me that I would listen to his advice if he was so kind to share it with me. So one thing that then also had effects on my further career, I would say, is the University of Bonn had two exchange programs that were quite competitive to get in. One was to UC Berkeley, and one was with NSAE, which is the École nationale de la statistique et de l'administration économique, so a grande école in Paris, one of the big schools. And I wanted to apply for this semester away or a year away. And typically everyone applied to Berkeley. Yeah, no, because Berkeley was like Berkeley. Yeah, in terms of university, it seemed so clearly to top a French grande école.
Mhm.
So I went to him to ask him whether he would write me a reference letter. And the rule of the game was you could only apply either to Berkeley or to Paris, but not both. Yeah. So I
Yeah.
asked him, if what should I do? Should I apply to Berkeley or to Paris? And I think I thought he would probably say Berkeley. Why not? I mean, it's so obvious. But he said, look, I think you should swim against the river. That is the German expression translated to English, and probably it's slightly different in English. You should swim against the river. Everyone wants to go to Berkeley. You should go to Paris. And then he gave these quasi prophetic words: if life wants, you will go to Berkeley later.
Huh.
So I applied for Paris. I got in and spent my last year of studies abroad in Paris. And he was right, because then during my PhD studies, I did go to Berkeley for a term and spent 5 months with David Cart. And
Ah,
that's where our lifelines met. Yeah.
oh, wow. 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 So you go to Paris school. Well, I want to hear both of those stories. So you end up going to Paris. Uh what was it like as a student at Paris? I've never spoken to I actually don't know a lot about Paris School of Economics.
Yeah.
What was it like?
Um, it was great. I mean, there were three or four of us from Bonn that went, and we were a group that also did a lot of stuff together.
Mm.
So this being a Grande École, so it's not the Paris School of Economics, but the École Nationale de Statistique, ENSAE.
Mm,
Um, they were also very techy. Yeah, so
mm,
a lot of the students there had an extremely strong math background. So there would be courses like stuff on Brownian motions and finance. So you would have relatively techy subjects.
yeah.
Um, and the kind of strange thing, given my math background, is I did best in the more verbal subjects, where as a foreigner I should be disadvantaged. Yeah? But it seemed to be the case that French students, relatively speaking, had all formulas in their head programmed. Yeah. Whereas in German universities, you're always allowed to bring your formula booklet, like whatever, the Pythagorean theorem. Okay, that one I would know, but all these cosine theorems. Whereas in France, you have to memorize them. Yeah?
Ah.
You have to know that. And that I wasn't aware of. So in these kind of subjects, I sometimes struggled with certain sub exercises, and in the more verbal ones, I did extremely well. So that's one thing I remember. And also, these Grandes Écoles are kind of a group of universities by themselves, yeah, that see themselves as elite schools. So there was a squash league and a rugby league just for these schools, and they
Mhm.
did not play against the state universities, but these elite schools would do their own sports leagues. And I also played in a squash team for the NSO team, and we had stuff like a wine lovers club and a museum club. So they had lots of these clubs, which wasn't a thing in German universities really at the time. Yeah.
Mm, mm, mm. So so you're at Paris. Do you it's a very technical program? Is that what you're saying? It's very technical. And what about so you I noticed one of your most cited papers is it's in Stata Journal. And it's all on average treatment effects. And so now I'm just kind of making this link now. You go to Berkeley and you're with Card. Are you sort of getting
As a visitor, yeah.
as a
So I did
visitor,
a
right?
PhD there.
Right. And so are you getting at your visit with Card, are you sort of getting some of this causal inference kind of experience, or is that something that, where did you first start kind of picking that up?
Yeah, no, that started earlier. So I then finished my diploma, which is somewhere halfway between a master's and a bachelor, in Bonn in 1997. And de
Mm,
facto on the ground, I was in Paris because that was my last year of study. That was counted at Bonn. From there, I go to EY in Florence. And that is the biggest graduate program in the social sciences in all of Europe, in
mm.
Florence, Italy, and brings together students from all across Europe. And there, one of my teachers is Andrea Ichino, who
Oh yeah.
had just joined. I think in the first year I was there, he was still on a kind of postdoc position. And
Mm,
then from 1998, he is a full professor. So while he's there, he applies for this full-time job and gets it. And he had done the PhD at MIT and
mm.
must have overlapped with Angrist because the microeconometrics, the way he taught it at the time, I think was so out of the box, and he may have been the first in Europe. It would be interesting to try to trace that. Who was teaching this local average treatment effect?
Ah,
Um, So in 1998, I
yeah,
sat through this course, and there was no textbook at the time. Yeah, so there was no mostly harmless econometrics. There was nothing of that style.
right.
But his lecture notes had all the material that then years later we would see in mostly harmless econometrics. Yeah,
Yeah.
and he taught that year after year. So I think he trained generations of economists in this stuff before it became kind of the standard material in
Mm.
PhD programs.
He goes to Europe from
Yeah,
MIT carrying with him some of
yeah,
that Angrist style
yeah.
work. Wow.
And also Josh would visit EUI. So while I was there, Josh came to teach short courses. Also Guido Imbens came. So these
Mm.
guys would give short courses to students, exposing them to their latest thinking.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure in how many other European places at the time they would give these courses, but clearly given Ikino's links
Yeah.
with them personally,
Yeah.
was the opening the door to these developments in
Wow.
at least in Florence. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, you're young and you're probably not necessarily, I'm just thinking out loud. If you're young and this is your first exposure to microeconometrics, it might not seem as though it's necessarily, unique, I guess. I mean, but did you get a set? Were you sort of intrigued by it in a way that you sort of look back and notice it was had an
Yeah,
impact?
absolutely. So what was clear is there were only these lecture notes. Yeah.
Yeah,
So in all the other subjects, there was a
there were
textbook.
books. There was a
Yeah.
textbook, right?
And Ikino always said, well, I would like to point you to something, but this is all I have.
Right.
It's super fresh. It's cutting edge stuff to some extent.
Mm,
And again, look, this was pre-internet. It's not like you would constantly get the latest working papers into your inbox. Yeah. So knowledge transfer
yeah,
in these days, pre-internet or early days of internet, relied even more
on
on
the professor.
knowing
Yeah,
the people who were
yeah,
developing stuff, you know?
yeah. That's been my conjecture for years. Is that is exactly my conjecture that I've been saying to people forever, which is that this spread of causal inference, because it didn't move through the textbooks and it moved through more of the applied econometrician or the applied worker, it moved through the labor markets more than it moved
Yeah,
through the
yeah.
books. Yeah. So you feel that way too.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Wow.
I
Huh.
think without these personal links, I would not have been exposed to that in those calendar years, 1997,
Mm.
98, 99.
Wow.
And then Ikino would teach the local average treatment effect stuff, but also matching. And back in
Yeah.
these days, everyone did matching. Yeah. And in my cohort, I guess all the applied people were using matching estimators. And that
Mm.
was seemed to be the future. Yeah. You
Yeah.
only need to do careful matching and you get at causality, you
Right.
know?
Right.
And this is also what then propelled us to write this data code, because back then there was no code.
Yeah.
And we worked on that for 1 or 2 years.
Wow. Wow.
We had no idea that this accompanying paper in this data journal would be so highly cited.
Yeah.
I find it crazy that still today it collects hundreds of sites every year, because in some pockets of the scientific community, matching is still in its heyday,
Yeah.
like medical sciences. I think lots
Right.
of citations are still going there.
Yeah.
Whereas in econ, it then crashed completely after
Yeah.
some years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
maybe now it's seeing a little bit of a resurgence with the work by King and cause and exact matching. Or it's maybe one little appendix table where you also show, by the way, if I do a careful matching, I find something similar.
Right.
But back then, it was the way to causal
Mm.
inference in
Wow.
our minds. Yeah? And then based on that paper and the code, just immediately after I got out of the PhD and went to Munich for my first job,
Mm.
I would then get invitations to teach courses. So in the 2000s and early 2010s, I gave, I think, 20 to 25 PhD courses across Europe in
Mm.
7 or 8 different countries. And originally it was always we want something, someone to teach us matching. Yeah, that was
Ah,
what people cared about most.
yeah.
I always said, look, you should also try to understand IV and
Right.
not just IV as a press the button methodology, but the philosophy behind it. What am I identifying? What are the causal parameters and all of that?
Yeah.
And over time, people also wanted to see less and less matching. And at some point, it was more like me saying, before we forget about it completely, I don't think it's useless. You should still also learn about matching. So I shifted the weights within my course, but I gave, probably 25 of these short courses between 5 and 30 hours
Yeah.
all across Europe.
Wow. So these were basically causal inference workshops.
Yeah, exactly. And I was always using these slides, Equino
Yeah.
slides. Then I
Ah,
added more and more of my own, but
yeah.
that was the starting point. And
Yeah.
only then at some point, the Mostly Harmless book came out. And then I said, okay, here are my lecture notes. You will see they are whatever 90% overlap with the Angus Pischke book. But
Yeah.
and then I would point them to the book essentially. But the core were these lecture notes
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
had developed.
That's great. So did you ever think about writing up the lecture notes into a book?
Now, after, well, early on, when there were only these lecture notes and no Angus Pischke book, I was maybe tempted, but I was on kind of tenure track. I needed to
Yeah.
get papers published. I didn't want to waste time working on a textbook. And
Right.
then once the Mostly Harmless book came out, I felt there was no point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I never did
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah. That's crazy. That's amazing. That is the first time I have heard anyone confirm this hunch that I've had for a long time, which was causal inference spread more through the applied community than it did through the econometrics textbooks. That's great. Well, so you were you doing economic history in graduate school? Did that end up being in your dissertation?
No, the crazy thing is, I never in my life attended an economic history lecture.
Uh-huh.
And the reason for that is at Bonn, where I did my undergraduate, there was no economic historian. The only thing we had was history of economic thought, but there was
Yeah.
no economic history. And also, again, in Florence at the European University Institute, there was no economic history. So I never sat in an economic history until this day, really.
Mm,
Um, and how did I end up working on history topics? So really, in my PhD, I was a labor economist. Yeah.
yeah.
So my PhD thesis was looking at job displacement, the cost of job displacement, and I was doing some stuff on returns to education. Then we had been working with Equino on a paper on this phenomenon in most Southern European countries that young people move out from home very late. Yeah, in Italy
Uh,
back in the day, the median age of moving out from home was larger than 30. So
really?
especially young men would stay at home forever, and even after they moved out, they live within a few kilometers from their mom. Yeah. And that was a topic that fascinated us. So all of that was labor.
Yeah. Is that more of a
So how did I
male?
end
Is that more
up?
of a male phenomenon or even females?
Even females, the average age of moving out is much higher than in Northern Europe.
Right. Sorry, I interrupted you. Keep going.
Yeah. So how did I end up today, at least, working mostly with historic data? That was following advice by Equino,
Mm,
my PhD advisor, with many years delay. I remembered a sentence he said. So this paper in the QJE that I have with Ludger Wößmann on the Protestant ethic, or the alternative to the Protestant ethic in terms of human capital theory, was an idea that Ludger and I, my co-author, had been bouncing around for several years, somehow thinking, okay, what is it, this Protestant ethic? It sounds very fluffy, How would
Yeah.
you even measure a Protestant ethic?
This is
Thought,
Weber.
well,
This
isn't
is
it the
like the Weber
case?
this is
Yeah,
the Weber hypothesis.
yeah, that's the Weber hypothesis. Yeah.
Right.
So we both grappled a bit with even the concept of the Protestant ethic, and at the same time, I guess both Ludger and I are churchgoers. He's Catholic. I went to a different church. We thought, well, isn't it that Martin Luther, translated the Bible to German, and he said that, as a quote we had in mind, that everyone should be able to read the Bible. Yeah. And he said that at a time in the early 16th century where literacy rates were maximum 10%. Yeah. And then making that statement, everyone should be able to read the Bible by themselves, sounds like completely mad. Yeah. But that was a call to a public education program, more or less. Yeah. And so we thought, well, assume this call by Luther really had consequences, then couldn't it be that Protestants are more educated earlier on in history, and that then translates into higher incomes, and that it's not so much that Protestants work harder and save more for the future, but that they are more educated. Yeah?
Right.
So that was the idea. And then we thought, well, how would we go about that? How would we convince readers of a causal effect? If we were to go to modern day data, year 2000 something, then in any Western country, we've by now had various waves of migration, atheism is on the rise, so we have so many different religious groups, Catholics, Protestants, Muslims, Jews, atheists, Buddhists. How would we ever find an instrument to figure this out if there are these multiple groups? So then I remembered a statement by Ikino, who always told his students, if you have an idea, you should always ask yourself, if I could go to the fairy queen and wish for data, what would it be? And even if that data that you wished you had doesn't exist, that is your reference point of what the perfect quasi-experiment would look like. Yeah. So then we had this discussion, okay, modern day data, year 2000 something, maybe we would struggle to make a causal inference case. So probably we have to dig further back in time and try to find historic data.
Yeah.
Because in our naive thinking, and today I think about these issues differently, 100, 200 years ago, everyone was religious. Yeah. So, and at the same time, there were essentially only Catholics and Protestants and a small Jewish minority, but all these other complications, atheists, didn't exist. So we deliberately started searching for historic data without ever having been to an archive before. Yeah. Because we both weren't trained economic historians. So we started Googling around for data, census data. We had no clue. So I also sent emails to the most famous German economic historians of the day 15 years ago and asked them, okay, are you aware of any data source in Germany for, say, the 19th century or even earlier 18th century, 17th century, where you have both religious denomination, schooling, and income? Yeah. And they all came back saying, yeah, we think you only have such data at the aggregate level, but not regionally disaggregated. We've never come across anything like that. And that sounded like a bummer. Yeah? And then we parked the idea. But every now and then I would just Google again, hoping that at some point something pops up. Yeah?
What were you looking for? What was it that you were looking for? Exactly.
We just felt it has to be at least data disaggregated to the county level so that we have hundreds of units of observations as opposed to something very aggregated.
Yeah.
And then one night I Googled again and found something from a village close to Berlin. A hobby historian had
Ah,
written up the city history or the village history and said, according to the census of 1871, our little village had 50 inhabitants, 30 Catholic, 20 Protestant, and 40 could read and write and 10 couldn't. And then I thought, yes, yeah. So we went out, dug out this census from
that census, the
1871.
1871 census is what
Yeah,
triggered
and
it?
all of that, yeah, meant that was the starting point of us using historic data. Yeah.
Ah, so keep going. So then you get that. What do you get? What do you find when you get that 1871 census?
So what we then show in that paper is that indeed in Protestant areas, literacy rates are higher. And also then we found other census type data on occupational shares. So we found that in Protestant areas, there are more people working in manufacturing and services as opposed to agriculture. So
Uh-huh.
these areas seem to be more developed. There's an earlier move out of an agricultural society. And
Mm,
that were essentially the main pieces of that work. Yeah, religion
mm,
seems to predict literacy, and also seems to predict economic outcomes, economic success. And
yeah,
here we go with an alternative story for the same facts that
right,
Weber observed,
right.
and may all be just explained by human capital as
The human
opposed to
capital.
a work ethic. Yeah.
Right, right. Wait, so is the testable prediction also that you'll find these higher rates of literacy amongst the Protestants, but not the Catholics, or is it a more general Christian thing?
Well, we just contrast Protestants and Catholics, yeah, because
Oh, you
that's the
do.
yeah, yeah.
You find the higher rates of literacy amongst the Protestants.
Protestants, yeah.
Wow. 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 What was the reaction amongst, historical and religious, experts? What was their reaction to this? I mean, it's been 100 years since Weber, but it's still a
Um,
well-known theory.
well, some pushback came on one hand from Weberians. There is this whole group of people for whom Weber is a god.
Yeah.
If you criticize him, you must have misunderstood him.
Right.
But
Right.
there was some guys who would say, no, 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 you are misrepresenting Weber. He never said what you claim he said. So there was a bit of this.
Yeah.
Then among, say, more Reformation historians,
Yeah.
there was a bit of an outrage. How dare you pool data from all across Germany? You are not giving a due diligence to understanding the microhistory of this city and that city, because historians often want to understand in every single detail one small geographic unit. And for them, it's outrageous if you try to make average statements
Right.
across hundreds of geographic units.
Right. 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 That must have been it seems like give it's not your first history paper though, right? Because I thought I saw you have something on Luther and female education in the 19th century a little bit earlier, but I know the publication lags can make this show
Yeah.
up at different times. Did you work on the Protestant paper before the QJE before that Luther paper, or is it what's the
Yeah,
connection?
yeah. So this 2008 paper with the title Luther and the Girls was conceived later. Yeah?
Ah, okay.
But there was a special issue of the Scandinavian Journal of Economics, edited by Alan Kruger, of all people.
Oh, wow.
And we submitted it there. And since that was a special issue, the review process was super quick. Like we sent it, we got reports, we had X weeks to put in a revision. And suddenly this thing appeared in, I think, December 2008. And from that point on, because we use the same instrument that we use in a QJE paper, and the QJE paper was also submitted at the same time,
Mm,
we were a bit nervous that some referee or barrow would say, oh, wait, you've used this instrument before. This is no
right.
longer novel. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You're hoping they're not.
Reality,
Yeah.
The real order had been that the QJE paper was conceived much earlier, and
Right.
the one that got published earlier was a spin-off. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Their instrument is it distance to the printing press? Is that the instrument or what's the
No,
instrument?
distance to Wittenberg, so distance to the cradle of the Reformation, so where Martin Luther was a professor at the university.
Oh,
Yeah,
it's distance to basically Luther.
yeah, distance to Luther. Yeah.
Huh. Huh. So because what you're using the the I actually don't know the history of the spread from Luther, but it's just basically you're able to document that conversion to Protestantism is sort of based on that geography. It's just based on the distance to Luther.
Yeah, so what we did back then was really quite simple. We produced maps of the share of Protestants in
Mm,
1871, so 350 years after the Reformation.
mm,
And it struck us that somehow everything within 200 miles around Wittenberg seemed to be Protestant. And
mhm.
then there were some areas that seemed to be 50-50 Catholic Protestant.
Yeah,
Then beyond that, everything seemed to be Catholic. So
yeah,
that made us think, oh wow, maybe there is some spread concentrically
yeah,
around the cradle of the Reformation about Luther City.
yeah.
And so that's how we went about it. But we did not really document the actual spread per se, but we had
Yeah.
this map in 1871 and it seemed to correlate with distance, and that gave birth to that instrument. In the
Yeah.
meantime, with other co-authors, we've written papers, one published 3 years ago, one in the making, where we really show the micro spread.
Ah,
Yeah,
is that
and
well known
a
amongst
network type paper. Yeah.
is that well known amongst the Reformation scholars? Do they sort of appreciate that geographic component?
Um, yes and no. There is a bit this saying that Luther's influence was strongest in the vicinity of Wittenberg,
Mm,
because he was at the time already a papal bull had been issued against him in
yeah.
1520. So the Pope wanted to stop him from having more influence. So at some point he was geographically constrained in his
Oh,
travels. Yeah.
he's
And
stuck in
that
that
meant
area.
he could
Yeah.
exercise more influence nearby, but not
Yeah.
so much further away.
Oh, yeah.
But what we are doing now in this ongoing work is to document also his correspondence. So thousands of
Mm,
letters have survived, incoming letters, outgoing letters to various cities. We also know which students studied with him in Wittenberg, who
get out
then
of here.
typically afterwards would go back home and spread the news about the Reformation. And so we can now more carefully document what back in that QJE paper was merely a statistical exercise, so to say.
Wow, wow. So does this project with the that turned into the QJE, is this responsible for this big part of your life now of being an economic historian and then focused even on the religion part?
Yeah. So the way I typically tell the story is it's all Robert Barrow's fault. So in the first revision, we only had, I think, one outcome variable, this share of manufacturing and services, as a measure of economic development. And then Barrow said something like, this is all nice, but we need to see it robust. You need to show us for many more different outcomes that you find the same result and that it's not just a fluke in the data. So we went and collected additional outcomes. We collected tax statistics, wages of the poor. We collected all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
And then Barrow wrote something like, I see this is robust. This can go in a footnote. And then we have this footnote, I don't know, footnote 44, where we say, we also looked at blah, 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 blah. And I always say, this footnote is worth $20,000. Yeah, because digitizing this data, blah blah blah, cost us. It was a complete nightmare. But then we suddenly had all these data sitting on our drive
Uh-huh.
that only were buried in a footnote.
Right.
And we thought, what else could one do with this data, you know? And
Yeah.
then there it slowly spread. Yeah.
So Barrow, the same way the Pope pushed Luther in a particular direction, Barrows and that footnote has pushed you in a particular direction.
Yeah, yeah. Barrow
Yeah.
made me economic historian, and I think he doesn't even know.
That's great. Uh, well, one of the papers I saw last year, when we were at that conference together, I saw you present just this really fascinating paper, and I was curious if we could talk a little bit about it. This National Socialism and Christian Names paper. Can you tell us a little bit about that paper? Because there's lots of parts to it that are really interesting.
Yeah. So funnily, it is in my head quite related to the Weber paper in the
Yeah.
following sense. So I think what I learned over time is that my naive thinking that in the Middle Ages everyone was religious
Right.
was nonsense. Yeah,
Oh,
everyone may have been member of a church,
yeah.
and even in the 1920s 99% of people in the census are either Catholic or Protestant or Jewish, because the statistical category of being without a religious denomination didn't exist. Yeah, maybe in 1925 there was then for the first time a category for it, and 1% of the population declared themselves without a church affiliation.
Hmm.
But for sure, not everyone was like a diehard Pentecostal type
Yeah.
Christian. Um, so then, also looking back, even at Martin Luther's own writings, he 20 years into the Reformation period, he wrote that he was really concerned about the future of the church. And one reason he wanted to reform it and change the Catholic Church into something better was that he was concerned that Christianity could die. Yeah?
Ah,
So what they did in the Protestant areas is to send out people from Wittenberg to do church visitations. Yeah, so they would
ah,
send them to the countryside, to the local parish. They would talk to the pastor, they would talk to the members of the congregation, and they would ask them basic stuff like, what are the four evangelists in the New Testament? Yeah, and then I should say Matthew, Luke, John, Mark. Yeah? And they often came back and they said the pastor didn't know any of this. Yeah.
uh-huh.
They were just completely shocked that there is someone who is supposed to teach the flock the Christian basics and has no clue, you know?
Yeah.
And then there is some work out there that, or it has been known for decades when it comes to Nazi voting, because the paper you just talked about is about the rise of Hitler. It has always been known that the strongest predictor of Nazi voting, the single strongest predictor in a kind of machine learning prediction exercise sense, is Protestantism.
Uh-huh.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, that could be that Protestants are just nasty people.
Yeah.
They're all anti-Semitic and the Catholics are good people.
Right.
Or it could mean something different. It could mean something deeper. And then we start to think, okay, well, where did Protestantism ultimately succeed? Well, it succeeded more in the northeast of Germany than in the south of Germany. And that makes you think about, well, how did even Christianity spread?
Yeah.
Well, in the Roman Empire, which cut Germany in two parts, it spread by word of mouth.
Yeah.
But then outside the Roman Empire, the world remained pagan for a much longer period.
Mm.
What we then learned over time is that within modern day Germany, whereas in the south, in parts of Bavaria, which is the most staunchly Catholic part of Germany, Christianity arrived before the year 300. But at the Baltic Sea, it arrived in the year 1300. Yeah, so it took 1,000 years longer for Christianity to even make it to the north of Germany.
Mm.
Yeah, and that may have some impact.
Yeah. Yeah.
Christianity isn't as deeply rooted. And also what Reformation historians have described is that the Catholic Church wasn't as strong in the north of Germany as it was in the south of Germany. So there was never as much buy-in into Christianity per se. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So could it be that Protestantism is not just yet another denomination, but at the same time, it also reflects maybe a more, as we call it, shallow type of Christianity? Yeah. But then, of course, it's not a black and white picture. It's not just Protestant Catholic, but there must be regional variation, because there were clearly also centers like Wittenberg, Martin Luther's own town, where Protestantism was strong and kicking. Yeah. But maybe further away from that in the countryside, Christianity per se was just an incidental thing, but not down in people's thinking. Anyway, so piggybacking on also work of other people who've shown that, Janet Benson, for instance, that first names often transport family background. Christian parents are more likely to give their kids Christian first names. Maybe we can read from that the religious fervor of people.
Mm-hmm.
And it then turns out that, the religious first names predict Nazi voting. Now, you wouldn't want to write a paper just for that. We then also collect evidence on surviving pagan cults in parts of Germany based on a huge anthropological survey, and that has a similar flavor, that where there is more pagan belief still surviving into the 20th century, also that predicts Nazi voting. And ultimately, we also look at gravestones, and probably when you saw me present this, that didn't exist yet. So on gravestones, people could have a cross or they don't have a cross. Yeah? And having a cross or not may again symbolize and demonstrate whether the family of that person is a Christian believer or not. And also that is predicted.
Yeah. Well, so what's the big idea in this paper? Are you just trying, I mean, I would think actually that first stage or whatever of predicting voting for National Socialism is, you said it's the name, the Christian name.
Yeah.
It would be what, like John or David or something? What would it be?
Yeah, exactly.
Biblical name.
What is the bigger question? The bigger question is, there is work on political religions. And so what I told you is, so to say, what is the statistical relationship that we are exploring? But what is looming in the background is the fact that the Nazis used religious language to refer to their own party. Yeah, so Hitler is usually described as the savior of the German people. The Nazi greeting, where they would raise the right arm and is Heil Hitler, Salvation Hitler. Hitler would give speeches and end them with Amen.
He would.
Like the church. Amen. There were all kinds of religious symbols. The swastika, in German, is called Hakenkreuz, so a cross with a bend. So the word cross is in it. They had all kinds of ceremonies that have the flavor of religious ceremony. And someone who is a deep-rooted Christian may probably find that outrageous that
Yeah.
there is someone who claims to be the savior.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
that's if Christianity is only an outer veneer, but not
Yeah.
really something heartfelt. Maybe you find that more appealing. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a cult. That's very cult like. I mean,
yeah, yeah.
In the United States, the cult leaders will claim that kind of that, around where I live, David Koresh, the cult leader in the 90s, that's what he would talk that way. Not the racism part, I don't know, but wow, that's fascinating. Uh huh. Well, so I mean, have you completely sorted into economic history to the exclusion of that original labor? I mean, there's a lot of human capital all throughout what we've been talking about. So, have you sort of, but are you, do you sort of self-identify your research agenda mainly in history now, or is it spread over lots of different things?
No, I've always worked on several things and often at the same time.
Yeah.
Because I also often get bored if I work on the same topic for too long. So in the past few years, I've done some work on Brexit,
Hmm.
to get over the referendum result in the UK. I wanted to understand it better.
Yeah.
Um, I'm doing stuff on labor market still. So I had some work on a correspondence test,
Hmm.
trying to see whether employers discriminate against women based on fertility
Yeah.
or expected fertility. I'm still doing a follow-up project on that. So I think it's still a mix of labor economics, political economy, and economic history.
Yeah.
But these weights from year to year shift a little bit. But
Right. Right.
probably the most prominent stuff is the economic history side of things.
Yeah.
But my heart still beats also for labor economics and
Yeah.
for political economy. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, if I know this is an impossible question, but I'm just sort of curious if you're able to do it. If I could like talk to your co-authors, if I could talk to your, Aquino, and they could, step as far, sort of step at a distance and look at you, and they could sort of collaborate and say, I think the reason Sascha is as successful of an economist, is in terms of his scholarship and his being able to produce at this high level. I think it's because he's like this, like this kind of secret, the unobservable, what do you think people would say? And I know you're modest, so you probably aren't comfortable, but like if you could just sort of describe what sort of makes you different, or what is it that has made it so that you are able to write papers consistently over your career, over and over and over again, in a way that you have what's the secret?
So first of all, I don't think that in by any metric I'm extremely successful, but maybe given the humble beginnings in a house with no academics in it, I have got to a point that I myself thought I could never get to. So I'm deeply thankful to the people along the way who made that happen and the many coincidences, people just being nice and supportive and inspiring me. I think what people might say is that I I read quite widely, and I myself think of myself mainly as a social scientist. Yeah,
Mm,
so I'm the complete opposite of being tribal. Yeah,
yeah.
so I hate tribalism, and
Mm,
hopefully people enjoy working with me because I have a passion for stuff and I may have quirky ideas sometimes,
mhm.
drawn from reading completely seemingly unrelated stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but I've always found that the only way new research can flourish is if you do it slightly differently than what would be expected. You have to bring together different things. All my career, I've worked with historians, hardcore historians. I enjoy working with sociologists. It's giving me so much because they read completely different literatures. They think so differently about the world, and only that can make you think differently. And these relationships, maybe they also gain from me having read other stuff that they do. And yeah, I think I'm passionate about what I do. That's the one thing. Topics are often close to my heart. Like the work I've been doing on the persecution of Jews, anti-Semitism, and so on. I really feel strongly about these things. I want to understand them because I would love the world to be a better place. And understanding on the one hand, why do people do such atrocious stuff is something that drives me. At the same time, I'm now doing work on the righteous among the nations, so people who helped rescue Jews. I want to understand what makes people be willing to put their own life on the line to rescue the life of someone else. Anyways, I want to understand human nature.
Well, it has been so nice talking. I have one more unusual question, and then I know I've kept you for a long time. I want you to imagine, if you could go back in time and talk to that assistant professor that was you, or the graduate student that you'd been, and maybe he doesn't recognize you. He obviously can't imagine that his future self would be coming back in time. But you sit down and you meet him, and you're having coffee at a coffee shop, and you're talking to him and you're listening to him, but you also kind of share with him. What do you think you'd really wish you could go back and tell that young person, if you had a day or so to be with him? What do you really wish you could go back and tell him now that you're sort of 20, 30 years later, that you really feel like would be sort of valuable to a young person like that, like you were?
I think the biggest mistakes in my academic life were in the first 2 or 3 years after the PhD. I didn't send out several papers of my PhD thesis. Out of a mix of perfectionism and thinking I need to work on something else because that's more exciting. So I think wasted several papers of my PhD thesis that could be published, even if maybe not in a super top journal, but they could be published. And I would have learned so much in the submission process that was delayed. And I think doing that, since I was on a non-tenure track position, I even put the economic well-being of my family on the line. So I was married, we had 2 kids. And there I was. And after 5 or 6 years, I had the Stater Journal and one European Economic Review and an economics bulletin. So I had 3 publications and maybe one of them in a decent journal. And my career was about to run against the wall. And then that QJE R&R came through, and that changed my life forever. But this was all my fault. There was stuff sitting on my hard drive in my desk drawer that I never submitted. And what an idiot I was. And that's the one thing I keep telling junior colleagues when I have mentorship meetings, and I also keep telling my students, don't do the Sascha thing, but send your stuff out. If you never submit, you never get an acceptance.
Right. Wow. And that's you think that's because that's kind of correlated even with your success a little bit, the passion, the working on things that you love, working on things you're excited by. The flip side of that might be the like drudgery of sending out stuff that you're not excited. You sort of maybe had to, it's like there's this, they kind of come together a little bit.
Yeah, probably yes. Because yeah, I mean we all know that there is always still yet another thing you might do to
Yeah.
make it rounder and more complete. Um, but also on that one Barrow quote on a different person. There was a person who had been working on a topic for years and had collected 90% of the data. And everyone in the profession knew about that person working on this topic. And that person was also a perfectionist. And he only wanted to submit the paper when he had collected data for 100% of the countries in the world. And he only had 90%. And he never submitted. Yeah. And then at some point, other people collected the same data and submitted with 90% of the data.
Yeah.
Perfectionism can kill. Also, moving things forward for the benefit of society, not just for your own personal career, but at some point you have to call it a day and submit. That doesn't mean that you submit half-baked stuff, but perfectionism is the enemy of the good.
Yeah. That's great. Well, Sascha, I have thoroughly enjoyed this talk. I really appreciate you giving me your time.
Thank you. It was fun.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Well, you have a great day, and I guess it's day for you, right? It's the end of my day, but it's your days
Exactly.
starting. Yeah. Well, you have a great day.
You have a great afternoon and evening.
Okay. All right. Bye-bye.
Take care, Scott. Bye-bye.
Gonna see us through. Honey, you